bit of a constructive criticism video on the Sol-Ark 12K. For those of you who are possibly considering one of these, I'm not bashing the platform. Very skookum bit of kit, which, it should be given that, what it cost me. And other people who have these. It's just that, as with a lot of things, especially looking at it with an engineer's eye who's been doing off-grid solar for going on 12 years now, I can see ways that this can be made better, and again, that's the purpose of this video. So definitely, if you're considering one of these, because right now these are the only game in town that is, factory EMP hardened, definitely go for it, because, these have a lot to go for them. It's just, again, these could be made better, and that's the purpose of this video. First off, in terms of the cooling, the way the Sol-Ark is now, the heat sinks in the unit are mounted horizontally, and the air is blown in through fans on the right side of the case, out the left side. Problem is, because the heat sinks are oriented horizontally, no convective cooling beyond, dissipation of, a few tens of watts. So in a future hardware iteration, having the heat sinks oriented vertically, of course, with fan assist, because we'll need them at some point, but that way it takes a lot of burden off the fans will last longer, etc. Next, in terms of hardware improvements, I/O capabilities. First off, because this does have CAN bus and RS-485 network connections, problem is that right now those are geared only for interfacing with battery management systems and lithium-ion and lithium-ion phosphate batteries. So opening those up, and also so that way they can be simultaneously utilized, because I don't really know if, with the hardware that's in this now, they're capable of simultaneous utilization for different things, but if not, they should be. And also opening them up in terms of interfacing with, say, remote screens, PLCs, because a lot of PLCs either have or can support through add-on cards, RS-485 at least, and I think some can do CAN bus as well. And that way, for much more complicated systems, the PLC can be used for fairly complicated systems of dump load control, power management, etc. Stuff beyond the scope of this video, but they are capable of things like that. And some people, like High Tech Lab, uses a bunch of those for his own system. Very interesting channel, by the way. Highly recommended. Speaking of which, portable solar, if you ever want to expand your product line, which right now they're ridiculously busy with the geopolitical situation as it is, but at some point having a 48 volt PLC, so that way it will run directly off of the 48 volt battery connections, that is EMP hardened and can talk to the Sol-Ark for these purposes. Would be a good idea, just something that's just being useful, and you could sell them and make money. Next, and on the subject of PLCs and I/O expansion of the Sol-Ark, is adding native I/O. So at least 2 or 3 inputs and 2 or 3 outputs. Potential output, potential input, or logic level, dry contact, etc. For things like dump load control beyond just one contactor, up to 40 amperes at 240 volts, which is all the Sol-Ark is capable of right now, because again, the only output that this has is a pair of dry contacts for controlling a generator, and those can't be used for anything else, at least not with the firmware as extant in the unit. So definitely I/O control. And also related to I/O in terms of extra logic, well, not specifically logic because these would be analog, is a current shunt input connection, so that way the Sol-Ark is capable of tracking any charging electricity that is coming onto the 48 volt bus from anything other than itself. So say you have micro hydro setup, wind, supplementary solar that isn't going through the Sol-Ark, it can keep track of that in its own charge tracking algorithms. Yeah. Then on the subject of the software side of things, okay, pluck that off, just don't want the screen or the serial number visible, is for the user interface when you're configuring it, this screen with the various setup submenu access buttons, whenever you set anything on any of the various submenus, like for example basic setup, whenever you configure something on this screen, it boots you back to the previous screen. So that means for each of the things that you have to do, and there can be, a dozen or more of these screens you have to go through, it boots you back, or being booted back to that screen slows you down, and it can be kind of confusing to keep track of this. So rather than do that booting, just have a pop-up that comes up on the screen, and it just says setting configured, and then that setting, or that a pop-up despawns after a second or so, or it has a button on it that you tap and to just make it go away. But that would definitely improve the user interface. Also, on another subject, and I brought this up in a previous thing, or previous videos, but this is strictly a constructive criticism video. A touchscreen isn't strictly necessary for one of these things, and indeed, especially because this is a resistive matrix touchscreen, and those are kind of delicate and squishy because they have to be. That's how the resistive matrix works. That touchscreen constitutes a weak point of the system, because you can do some stuff. Okay, you can't even do that. For things like when you have this icon on one of the things, you can scroll between them with the up and down buttons, but you can't get to settings, which is the gear up there. And so if the touchscreen ever goes bad, well, you're basically hosed as far as changing any settings. So rather than have a touchscreen having just a non-touch screen and then more buttons, so something like the Midnight Solar, 9 buttons. This is a fairly good number to have. You could have, say, anywhere from 8 to a dozen or so. You'd be able to get a decent amount of stuff done. Only thing is, don't do what Midnight Solar did and have the main menu and status things, where they're these very thin, high aspect ratio, because they like to cock over on you if you don't hit them directly dead on. But yeah, just have a couple of say soft buttons on the bottom, plus increment, decrement, enter, escape, something like that. And also, on the subject of having a screen that is continuously illuminated, because with the Sol-Ark right now, they don't recommend having the screen continuously illuminated, and indeed they recommend not having it continuously illuminated because they don't know how reliable the backlight will be with time. So if you come up to the thing, you have to interact with it in some way. You can't just see, okay, I'm generating, say like right now, 240 watts on the solar, 80 watts going to the loads, a bit of electricity is going to the batteries, nothing to or from the grid. You can't see that if you just come right up to the thing without then pushing a button, tapping the screen, or whatever. So having a continuously illuminated or illuminatable screen would be good. And of course monochrome, because a lot of this stuff, the color, I mean, it makes it look kind of fancy, but it's not necessary. Also, things like how these moving chevron GIFs take up over a quarter, or something like a quarter of the screen real estate. It's not strictly necessary. So having something like a monochrome graphical TN LCD instead of thin film transistor, or even a monochrome TFT or something or other, because then also, because the backlight isn't having 70-80% of the light it produces lost in those the RGB subtractive color filters, means that the backlight can be driven at a quarter the intensity, which with the way LEDs work, it means that the blue dyes as well as the phosphor will last a lot longer, because they really like being underdriven in terms of longevity. So yeah, it's, again, overall fairly skookum piece of kit, and I am in the process of making preparations for another one. And because I forgot to include this in the last take, a couple more areas where the Sol-Ark can be improved. Two slash three specifically related to ganged or paralleled systems. One has to do with just the programming of the Sol-Ark, regardless of whether or not it's a standalone unit or ganged. Is first off the generator input slash dump load output slash AC coupled input. With gang systems as it is right now, they all have to be set to the same thing on all of the gang Sol-Arks if that output is being used. And those settings all have to be common across Sol-Arks. Whereas, especially for larger systems, it could be very useful where, say, one is for dump load slash smart load that you only want to come on when the batteries are absolutely full. You have another dump load where you don't give a monkey's toss as long as, you know, it only comes on whenever the batteries are above, say, 90% or 95% or whatever. So having that ability to have different settings for different Sol-Arks connected to different things, or even, say, like, as something which I would like to implement on these, if possible, and that ever becomes, you know, a thing, is where, yes, I've got dump loads and stuff, you know, I've got a whole dedicated electricity meter and load center for them, but there's also bits of the property where I get a bit of sun before, you know, anything else on the property gets sun, and I've got bits of the property where they get sun later in the day than anywhere else. However, the thing is, it's not big enough to justify, you know, a 4 to 6 kilowatt, you know, PV array, but I've got, you know, a couple microinverters, a couple spare PV modules, I can stick them there, and that way, say, first thing in the morning or last thing at night, or last thing in the evening, you know, I'm putting in, you know, 500 to 1,000 watts into the system, and, you know, 500 watts to 1,000 watts, you know, gets you somewhere. So, definitely a good way for this to be improved. Second, in terms of the guts, this is much more of a hardware modification, is bring out the internal DC bus to terminals so that way it can be paralleled between Sol-Arks. Because the way the internal architecture of the Sol-Ark and other similar inverters like this, I think like the Outback Skybox uses the same thing. Again, this is not me pulling the thing up, it's just me being familiar with how these things are implemented, because, you know, electrical engineer. Is internally inside the Sol-Ark, the battery charger, inverter, and maximum power point tracker are all tied onto a 3-wire. If you're very familiar with very old electrical stuff, you know this is the Edison 3-wire DC system, where you've got a DC neutral, positive hot, and a negative hot. In the case of this, it's a 400-volt system, so more or less. I haven't specifically measured because I haven't been able to get inside this thing because, you know, warranty seals. And again, $8,000. There's a positive 200-volt hot and a negative 200-volt hot, and that is what supplies things like the half bridges for generating the 2 phases for the inverter output, and then things like the battery charger and MPPT are just connected across the 2 hots, and they just, you know, feed 400 whatever volts onto the system. So by bringing those out, it means that in gang systems, it means that the electricity can be shared between Sol-Arks without 2 extra power conversion steps, either in the battery charger or in the inverter. And one thing that this would allow, and this is the third thing, is that it would allow each Sol-Ark to be on its own independent battery bank, because right now, when Sol-Arks are ganged together, they all have to be on a common 48-volt battery bank. Problem is that if you're expanding a system, it means either you have to buy an entirely new, very expensive battery bank, or you have to stick extra batteries onto a battery bank which is possibly a couple of years old, and then the performance of the new batteries will suffer. By having the ability for each Sol-Ark to be on its own independent battery bank, it means the new Sol-Ark gets its own separate batteries, the existing Sol-Ark stays on its original batteries, and it's a way of getting also very big battery banks in stages So again, saves money, and it also means that you can use different chemistries. And one thing where this could be useful is, say, for your everyday discharge battery, you have a lithium iron phosphate, like a Fortress or something, a Fortress Power, Simplify or whatever, something with fairly high cycle life, but not necessarily a screamingly long calendar life per se, because again, they're new enough that we don't really know enough yet. And that's the one that gets all the charging and discharging. And then another Sol-Ark is hooked up to either a flooded bank like this one, or say telecom, not necessarily high cycle life, but very long float life batteries. And then those batteries are floated by their own Sol-Ark, and they're only charged or discharged as needed. And so this is a way of having, again, for, say, your everyday day when you're only pulling, say, 10 kilowatt hours out of your battery bank, you can use something like a very high cycle life, well, I'm screaming high cycle life, but you can use something like like aforementioned, Fortress or what have you. That gets most of the abuse, or most of the use, but you've also got, say, a big bank of, say, North Star telecom batteries, and that just floats most of the time. But say you have crappy days without a lot of sun, and over the course of a couple of days you need to pull 30 or 40 kilowatt hours out of your battery bank, you can do that. So again, way of making this a lot better. And lastly, in terms of how the AC coupling is implemented, the Sol-Ark, and this is, again, this does not have anything to do with gang systems per se, because it would apply to this, which right now is a standalone unit. Although, knock on wood, it won't be within the next month or so. Is when the Sol-Ark is in AC coupling mode, it also supports frequency shifting, so it can boot its operating frequency outside of the 59.3 cycle per second to 60.5 cycle per second window as specified by UL 1741SA. So that way it'll trip any grid tie inverters offline. However, it only does that if the dump load / smart load, what have you, generator AC coupled input is set as an AC coupled input. They're not independently configurable. So having the ability to frequency shift when this is set to something else, again, very useful to do. And again, the thing is, shouldn't be that hard to fork the two processes inside software, but definitely that would be a very useful modification to the software to make, especially for people like me who have, again, those areas of the property where, doesn't justify, full, 4 odd kilowatts of solar, but stick up a couple modules, make a couple extra 100 watts in the morning or evening, or in my case both. Yeah, but again, skookum bit of kit, and just these are ways that it could be made even better than it already is. And one last improvement to be made with the Sol-Ark, because of course you couldn't remember this in any of the previous takes, is for the generator input / AC coupled input / dump load output, there is a meter on the panel, or on the metering menu, which says how much power is coming to or from that port. But it doesn't work because there aren't current transformers in the Sol-Ark for it to be able to monitor what is coming into or out of that port. So yeah, CTs to make that meter actually do something would be very useful in a future hardware rev, especially if there was a upgrade path for those of us who already has one of these things that doesn't have it.